Hello and welcome to Recap the podcast with me, Lucy Wheeler. Recap stands for Research in Education, Child Development and Parenting. And our mission is to embrace everyone and make everyone feel at home and part of a supportive community. Here on the podcast, you will find stories from parents, child development professionals, researchers, early childhood educators, and many, many more. So pop on those headphones while you walk the dog, grab a snippet during your lunch break or while your baby sleeps, and enjoy listening to some incredible stories from some truly amazing people. Welcome to Recap. Hello and a huge warm welcome to my guest today, Dr. Sarah Wall, who I'm very excited to chat to about all things special needs, parenting and the big C. So before we head into that, I just want to tell you a little more about our guest. Dr. Sarah Wall is a senior lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University with over 30 years' experience working in a variety of educational settings, including mainstream and special provision from nursery to post-16. She has had roles such as SENCo, senior teacher and specialist teacher, and developed a keen interest in children and young people with social, emotional and mental health needs. Sarah has lectured at the University of Northampton and the University of Birmingham, mostly in special educational needs, autism, and social, emotional, and behavioural needs. And she has worked with professionals from a variety of settings, including mainstream schools, special schools, pupil referral units, secure units, alternative provision, and residential schools, both here in the UK and worldwide. In 2017, Sarah completed her doctorate with her thesis entitled The Attuned School, the Effects and Effectiveness of Developing Relationships Between Pupils with Attachment Difficulties and Significant Adults. And on top of this, Sarah is also a mum of one, a wife and a friend to many. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome to the episode today the very lovely Dr. Sarah Wall. Welcome, Sarah. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Lucy. Wow, I can't believe how much, you're just talking about all the stuff that I've done. It's did I really do all that? So thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here as well. So yes, thank you for asking. I'm absolutely fine.
You are very, very welcome. It's so nice, isn't it, when you have a chance to reflect on all of the things that you do. And like you say, sometimes it can be a bit like, oh, have I really done all of those things? But it's amazing, all of the things that you've managed to fit in so far. And I'm sure I probably haven't, well, I know I haven't covered it all because we've spoken briefly about you being in a pantomime, which is another story that we'll come back to. But, this is just the tip of the iceberg of the amazing things that you've been doing. So it's so nice to have you here today to talk about some of them. So let's begin by talking about what you currently do. So you're currently a senior lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University. So you're supervising on the MBA course, as well as having supervisory roles for the EdD and PhD courses, which is amazing. You previously taught on the MA Education course as well. How did you get into teaching? Was it something that you always wanted to do?
So, believe it or not, I have wanted to teach so I'll give the game away. I'm 52 now. So for 43 years, I have known that I wanted to be a teacher because wow. I had a teacher who was phenomenal when I went into my middle school in year 5, a middle school in Suffolk. And she was just this ethereal wonder that was just beautiful for a start. She was utterly, utterly beautiful. And she had this long, dark hair that she could actually sit on.
Wow.
And she was a drama teacher. And you've just mentioned the fact that I'm in panto, so drama was my thing. And she was the lady who got me into theatre, because I played Supergran when I was 9 years old in our school play.
Wow, I remember
that was my that was my first foray into acting. And I had to do a Scottish accent, which I cannot do now, so I'm not going to. But then I could do quite a good one. But and she spoke fluent French. That was the one thing that I haven't managed to do. But she was a singer as well, and I've done some singing over my time as well. So she was the person who started me off wanting to be a teacher. And I kind of wavered a couple of times, I suppose. At one point I thought, shall I bizarrely, shall I be a physiotherapist? Not quite sure where that.
I wanted to be a physio when I was younger.
There you go. Bizarre. So does my mother. that was probably what kind of inspired me a little bit. But yeah, and sort of the odd kind of different idea, like, you know, acting was one of my passions when I was younger, and singing. But my mother said I had to get my education first, so I did, and then just carried on doing kind of amateur dramatics, really. But obviously, I mean, you know, I used my drama. I became a drama specialist. So yeah, but I've always wanted to be a teacher, and never anything different, really. And you know, even now that I teach in higher ed, I'm still teaching, you know, and I've taught. So I can honestly say I have taught from haven't done babies, but I've done from 3 years old, and our oldest PhD student was 80. So I've taught people from 3 to the age of 80.
Wow. Gosh, what a thing to do at that age as well. 'Cause it's so intense, isn't it? I'm doing my PhD at the moment, and I mean, my brain struggles a lot of the time with it. So to be at that end of the age spectrum and to get through something like that, that's incredible.
Yeah, amazing. I just kind of met. I wasn't their supervisor or anything, so, but I kind of had some dealings with them. So.
Yeah, it's funny you say that there was a teacher that kind of sparked that love, that passion to kind of want to go into teaching. I had a similar experience. I think she was my year 4 or year 5 teacher. Her name was Mrs. Johnson, and I absolutely adored her. She was my like Miss Honey, you know. I absolutely adored her. And I remember at that age she left to have a baby, and she called the baby Lucy, and I was like, she's called the baby after me. But she was brilliant. I suffered a lot with anxiety as a young child through primary school. Like, I hardly ever went into school in primary school. We had the truancy officer out. My mum was like, it was all around eating as well. And I was worried that I had a really strong phobia of being sick. So I then didn't eat because I was worried it would make me sick. And then and I had really bad separation anxiety with my mum as well. So I didn't want to leave her. So you're going to have to go to hospital if you don't eat, and if you don't go to school, they're going to put me in prison. And we had all of this through it. And this Miss Johnson was kind of my saviour at school. She was my safe place. So whenever I did get into school, she was who I gravitated towards. But like going off on a tangent already, but like I lived probably a 10-minute walk from my primary school, and my mum would take me to school, and by the time she'd walked home, she had a voicemail saying, Lucy's in the office, she doesn't feel well, you're gonna have to come back and get her. And she'd come back and get me, and I'd go home and I'd be fine because I'm back in my safe place with my safe person. And I had that. I know we're going to talk about attachment later, so that is not a complete tangent because that's why I touch upon that, but I had that really strong attachment with her. So having that kind of association with that teacher at school was really important to me. But for me, it was that attachment thing. It wasn't that I wanted to be a teacher, but the importance of having a strong teacher, I think, is a big one in primary school, especially when children are that young. I don't know if that's the same in secondary. I don't know what your views are on attachment with kind of primary age and secondary age, but I think that played a big part for me, having her there as my kind of safe space at school, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess we'll come back to the kind of idea around attachment and different settings, but bringing it back, I think, to my experience, because I went through a 3-tier system. So I was in primary school from the age of 4, 5, whatever age I started, through till 9. And then you sort of shift at a kind of, I don't know, a sensible age to me. I love middle schools, absolutely love them. So you go from a small kind of primary school into a slightly smaller middle school, and I adored my middle school time. I don't remember much about my primary school, apart from a couple of things that my mother tells me I did. Like, my brother got told off for doing something in school, and I felt so bad for him that I went and stood. This is in the days when they sent children to the corner. So he was standing in the corner. I felt so bad for him that I went to stand next to him to keep him company.
Oh.
That was one of the things I did. And I was never in trouble. I remember never being in trouble, except the last day of school. That was another story. The very last day of my primary school, when we were all lining up, and because it was the last day of school, everybody was high as kites. And so they were all chatting and having, just larking about and messing around and stuff. And they all got marched back out. So we had to do it again because we were all so noisy. But me, being me, I then decided that was the time that I'd open my mouth and start being like Larry. So I got sent to the head. That was my final day. Yeah, my final day of primary school. I got sent to the head teacher.
Oh, no.
I remember it. I do remember that happening. But yeah, so I don't remember much about it. I mean, the only other thing I do remember is sitting on the carpet in a primary school setting, as you do, and everybody's next to you. And we were singing with my knapsack on my back. And I remember thinking, I'm quite good at this, aren't I? And that was my first kind of love for, because I love music and I love singing and stuff.
Oh.
So they're about my 3 recollections of primary school. But middle school was kind of that next move up, so it was just slightly bigger. We were expected to do a few more things, but my year 5 tutor, she was our kind of safe base. We went off and we did music. Music was a specialist subject. PE was a specialist subject. But largely you had your kind of middle school teacher in the first couple of years and stuff. And then secondary school's a whole different ball game. And I hated secondary school for the first 3 years, so much so that I moved. I was bullied quite badly at secondary school. So yeah, but my mother was like, it'll toughen you up. But which I suppose it did, and it kind of, I know what it feels like. I've kind of experienced some of those things that some of our children and young people experience. So, you can kind of use that and draw upon that. But then I went to sixth form and loved it. So yeah, that was a different ball game altogether. But again, like you say, it is a lot to do with the people, because I cannot tell you one person at that secondary school, one teacher who I felt like I could go and talk to, because I never told anybody I was being bullied.
Yeah.
Whereas at the other schools, I can, middle school and the second, when I went to sixth form, I can think of some really key people who made a big difference in my life.
Yeah. I wonder how much effect it has kind of in primary school at that young age. You are ultimately with one teacher for the whole day, aren't you? And they teach you all of your subjects. And then you go into, I don't know what it's like. I didn't have the kind of primary, middle and upper. I just had primary school and secondary school where I live. So I don't know what middle's like. But when you go to secondary school and then obviously you have a different teacher and you're moving around a lot and you're kind of seeing each individual teacher for like an hour or 50 minutes and that's it. And some of them that's for the whole week for that person. So I wonder if that plays into it being harder to build those relationships with teachers enough to feel like you can trust them to talk to them. Whereas in primary school, they're there for the whole 6 hours that you're there. So I wonder if that maybe has an effect on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, time is important, isn't it? The amount of time. But also not necessarily the amount of time, I suppose. It's, there's that old kind of quality time, if somebody's going to give you 5 minutes or 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, I know lots of secondary school kids who I've worked with whose kind of key adults are not necessarily the people that they spend a great deal of time with, but they're the person that kind of does a check-in, 5 minutes, first thing during the day, or, last thing in the evening or the afternoon when they leave school. So yeah, I think it's different, but primary schools, a single primary school teacher can't necessarily be responsible for all of those children that they have as well. So they might spend a lot of time with them as a class, but they're never going to have a great deal of time with each and every one of them as well, I suppose. So there's lots of kind of different aspects to that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I didn't even think of it like that. And also, you saying, as you were talking, I was thinking as well, which moves us quite nicely onto what I want to ask you about next, is children that may have special educational needs. Their needs may be slightly different. So spending all that time with one person, if that person isn't meeting their particular needs, or even down to, like, you know, some children might want the closeness of a relationship with their teacher, whereas some other children may not want anyone to be kind of that close to them or within their personal space. Or, you know, when we talk about touch, and some children like a firm hug, others like a slightly looser hug, some don't like to be touched at all. So it's, I suppose it depends down on what the individual needs as well to build that attachment with them, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, it will very much depend on what that child's needs are,
Yeah.
in terms of, you know, if and mirroring and knowing that child. For me, it's about knowing each of those children, which, you know, again, it takes time to get to
Yeah.
know individual children and to know what makes them tick, and, you know, all these relationships. But interestingly, there's a great phrase that they taught me at teacher training college, which was "Don't smile until Christmas."
Okay.
They used to tell us, don't smile until Christmas, so that, you know, you established your boundaries and you were really firm and you were really mean and all of these sorts of things. And I just find that really interesting, looking back on, you know, now all my kind of, you know, decades of experience, and thinking that's actually the complete antithesis of what I would recommend that you do, you know, because it's all about kind of connection and saying hello, and, you know, being, you know, making sure that individuals are kind of feeling welcomed and all of those sorts of things. So it's how, isn't it funny how, you know, it's kind of turned on its head. However, having said that, some of the stuff that comes from the government has a similar kind of feel to it, you know, in terms of behaviour management, and the kind of behaviour management rolled out being very kind of discipline, you know, and rewards and sanctions and all of those kind of things.
Yeah. And I think talking to a lot of families who have stepped away from the mainstream system and things like that, that's something that I think that flags up a lot with them, and the reason that they're unhappy is that kind of lack of relationship building within the classroom for their children. So your background and your research interests, they're in and around special educational needs, and from your bio we heard that you've worked with a wide range of settings, a wide range of individuals. What drove that passion to work within the SEND sector?
Well, I'll be honest, and I kind of came at it by accident. So I was a very I was interviewed for a job as a Year 5 leader, and the person who interviewed me said to me, "What gives you the audacity to apply for this job?"
Okay.
And I'll have to be honest and say, at the time when I was 20-something, didn't actually know what the word audacity meant, so it was quite difficult to answer the question. But basically, it was because I wanted a bit of a challenge. So I didn't get. Suffice to say, I didn't get the job, probably because I didn't know what he was asking. But I then went back to my school, and my head teacher said, "Well, you've applied for a job. Why?
Yeah.
What's making you go?" And I said, "Well, I want a bit of responsibility. You know, I've been in the school for a whole year. This is the sort of thing you do when you're 20." And she said, "Right, okay. Well, if you want some experience of doing something different, how about being an assistant SENCo?" So I was like, "Okay, I don't know anything about special educational needs, but I'll give it a go."
Yeah.
And so I became responsible for years 5 and 6. And then the teacher who was the SENCo, probably about a year or so later, then left, and I took on the post fully. And so it was kind of all really by accident that I fell into it. But I then went off and did something else, which was go travelling around the world. My husband and I just decided that we wanted to do something else. So we sold our house, we jacked in our jobs, and we went travelling for a year. And then, of course, we came back to nothing. So it was like, okay, right, now what do we do? Okay, so we then went to Liverpool, and we supplied, and I became a supply teacher. And it was
Right.
there that they were struggling to get people to work in special educational needs schools, in SEND
Right.
schools. And they said, do you fancy it? You've got a background as a SENCo. Do you want to give it a go? And I was like, well, yeah, I'll give it a go, And yeah, I worked in a couple of special needs schools as a result. And the difference in terms of, how they're kind of managed,
Yeah.
what's important, they're so kind of different. And I loved working in those schools that I worked in. A general kind of feeling of just loveliness every day. You went to work and the kids were smiling. Yeah, the kids had some, obviously they had significant needs.
Yeah.
You had kids that would, get anxious and then they'd bite themselves, or they'd hit somebody or something, or throw stuff, or, so we had children with significant needs, but the general kind of feel was just a place of happiness and that sort of kind of environment. And that's really where I thought, this has cemented what I thought about wanting to kind of work with children who were who had a special educational needs or a disability, and seeing how you could kind of make a difference. Then it was only a tiny difference. I was a supply teacher, but then later I got a job as a specialist teacher for social, emotional, and mental health. And then, it was my job to go around mainstream schools and give advice and say, I think this would benefit this child, or this would benefit this child.
Oh, okay.
And the difference that I could kind of make doing that job, that was one of the best jobs I had. I did love my job as a specialist teacher for social, emotional, and mental health, because I could go in and I could ask fairly, straightforward questions, but, there'd be a complete turnaround in what was going on.
Yeah.
Just that kind of, person who can step back and look and see what's going on and make very small changes. So, for example, I asked, I was called to one young man, and I just asked him the question. I said, if there was one thing a miracle question,
Okay.
that's what we called it. So, I asked him the miracle question. If there was one thing that I could do to change, what's going on at school, what would it be? And he said, I just want to ring my mum. And that opened the floodgates. Why do you want to ring your mum? And turned out mum was actually, I think she was terminally ill. And, for obvious reasons, the child was really distressed and really concerned about it. And what we did, we just put in a telephone call, so he could call her at break time, at lunchtime, afternoon break. If he was feeling particularly worried about her, he could go to the office. And that was it. That was a turnaround, because what he was doing, he was misbehaving because he wanted to go home, because he wanted to be with his mum.
See his mum. Do you know what? And that's incredible that tiny adjustment of allowing that phone call, that connection with his mum during the day while he's away from her, it doesn't take very long, and it doesn't really cost anything to make that small adjustment, but that improved his experience and everyone else around him, because I assume that his behavior then started to improve because his needs were being met. So isn't it amazing to see that just a tiny tweak like that, but that was identified because a specialist teacher, i.e. you, had come in, assessed the situation, managed to pinpoint what could be done to rectify it. And so I guess that just shows the importance of having people with that specialist knowledge when it comes to special educational needs to be able to improve the experiences of children, even in a mainstream school. A lot of the time, children whose needs aren't being met, they get removed either by something like exclusion, or their families remove them for home education, which a lot of the families I speak to, that's a reason, or they take a place in a specialist school. But I guess there must be a whole lot of children that can thrive in a mainstream setting, as long as just a few reasonable adjustments are in place for them to be able to have that. And by the sounds of it, that example you gave us, it didn't take a lot of time, effort, or money to put in that adjustment.
No, absolutely. And I think, we hear a lot about, there's an awful lot in the media, in the press, about, local authorities being, £327 million in debt or £60 million in debt and things like that. And there was one just in the county that I live in on Friday, saying that the local authority is, I think it was £60 million in debt, and it's because of the high needs budget for SEND.
Right.
But the trouble is that if things aren't met, you kind of need to go to the lowest common denominator to meet need. And yeah, you're right. The county that I worked for eventually disbanded the whole of that special educational needs SEBD, as it was called back in that day, social motor behaviour difficulties team, completely disbanded it. And then, you had teachers who were like, I don't know what to do. They just genuinely didn't know where to go or kind of how to kind of manage individuals. But yeah, it can be something that doesn't cost very much money as well. Sometimes the smallest thing, because often the comeback will be, well, we can't meet their needs because we haven't got the money. Yeah, but not everything needs the money.
Yep.
Yes, if you want a significant adult who's going to go in and work with on a one-to-one basis with a child full time, that's going to cost you money. But actually, does that child need that all that time, or does that child need it at certain points? So, for example, one of the things that came out of my study, my PhD, was actually that a lot of schools put in support where it's not really needed. So they'll put it in maths and English because they think they need support with maths and English. But actually, that child doesn't need that support in maths and English. They need that support out on the playground where they're less structured situations and they can't manage. And if they can't manage, then things escalate, and then we have the baby ends up in a fight. And then what happens? We get exclusions, and just putting the support in either small things that make a big change, or putting the support in the right places can make a huge difference.
I guess as well, there may be instances where there may be an initial cost, for instance, getting a specialist teacher in to observe and find what support needs to be put in place. But that teacher doesn't have to be, a permanent full-time member of staff. So maybe almost like spot check-in, coming in, can you just have an assessment of this situation that we've got, or this child who has just come to us, do the initial assessment. And then the mainstream staff, or the staff at whatever setting that they're at, can then continue to put those things in place afterwards. So I suppose some things, yes, there may be an initial cost or outlay, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a prolonged one, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's kind of what my role was a kind of, when I first went, I had an amazing boss. She was a lovely lady. She was a really nurturing individual. And she said, it's support and challenge, Sarah, support and challenge. That's what we do. And I've always remembered that, because that was my job. So I'd go in and I would give them support and I would help them, but I'd also be challenging. So, for example, I would say, right, okay, I wrote this report. Out of those, 10 recommendations that I suggested, how many have you put in? And I would say, how many of you used, and how long have you used them for? Because that was another thing. Because I'd go into schools and schools will go, well, it doesn't work. And I'd say, well, how long did you try it for? Well, 2 weeks. Well, no, that's not going to work. You've got to keep doing it. You've got to be consistent and consistently put these things in place. And I was a teacher myself in a classroom, with children who are extremely challenging. Even when I first started teaching in my middle school, I had children who would climb out the window, partly possibly looking back because I wasn't really doing the things that I should have done. But we did have some challenging children. So it is about kind of using the right strategies. But you mentioned yourself there about anxiety, but the number of children who have an anxiety over something, for whatever reason that might be, maybe it is something significant trauma or whatever, and it's just about lowering their kind of levels of anxiety and things. And I went from being a teacher of social emotional behavioural difficulties, as it was then, now we would call it mental health, to being a specialist for autism.
Yeah.
And, you hear a lot of parents who say, well, they come home and their behaviour is off the scale.
Yeah.
And you pare that down and you go to the school and the school will say, yeah, but they're fine here.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, but they're only fine here because it's literally like that Coke bottle, and they are keeping that lid on that Coke bottle. And then when they feel able to explode, they explode. And that's what they do when they go home. And that's the same with, autistic children and young people, but children who have mental health issues, people, school refusers. I don't like that term either, because there's got to be something, there's something that's going on. So we need to kind of look at a lot at what's going on in schools.
And I think it's worth mentioning that the kind of acknowledgement that we're not saying that there's an expectation on teachers to be able to take on board all of this, because we know that teachers are already stretched in what they're doing. They're already limited in the amount of training around things that they're offered. They don't have the time, the respect, the value, the appreciation already in the role. And it's hard, to be one teacher in a classroom of 30. And if you've got 5 or 6 children that have different additional needs in addition to the general cohort, that's hard for one person to manage. So, I mean, me personally, I don't think the answer is that teachers need to be better at managing their classroom of 30. And that's why I think talking about the importance of having someone in that specialist role, and like the role of having a SENCo in a classroom or in a school, I think it's I know it's well acknowledged now, but I still think it's undervalued a little bit, because the importance that is placed on their role to be able to, like you did, identify things quickly, because they have the specialist knowledge to be able to go, actually, looking at that behaviour, I can tell that it's X, Y, and Z. Whereas your mainstream teachers don't necessarily have, well, the funding's not there, the time's not there for them to go and have all of these additional training and depth of knowledge as well. So it's hard, isn't it, to kind of place that expectation on the teachers, but also got all of these other types of settings. I did my university placement in a special school in my second year of my degree. First degree, my undergraduate, is 3 years, and each year you do a placement. So I wanted to do a different placement each year to gain my experience across the board. So my first year I did it with a childminder. Second year I did a special school, and a third year I did in a primary school. And the special school was my absolute favourite experience, because as you touched upon earlier, like, it's such a lovely environment to be in. However, it was probably the most stressful and exhausting period of my life that I've ever had. And hats off to people that work in these environments day in, day out, and like yourself, that have worked in the kind of special educational needs sphere, because I remember going in and I would be in there for like 6-7 hours a day, and I'd come home and I couldn't really string together a sentence, because I was so physically and emotionally drained from being switched on all day, learning all day, but also the emotion roller coaster for the children that I was working with obviously had an effect on me as well, because I'm there riding it with them. And it was such an eye-opening experience, and it was a scary experience at times, because some of these children, a school that ranged from early years age all the way up to 21, so they had like a college element at the top end as well. And because I did my placement there, and then I stayed on as a bank staff, so I stayed on afterwards. So when I was bank staff, I was placed here, there and everywhere. So I did some days with reception, some days in the secondary school, some days in the college. And so I had 18, 19-year-olds who had really severe additional needs. Some of them, their behaviour was quite unpredictable, anger and things like that. So I just found it so mentally draining and scary at some point. So I think it takes a certain type of individual to be able to cope day to day. I imagine the mental health stresses on people that work in that industry as well, it must be quite severe as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right in terms of takes a certain type of person certainly to stay in that profession. I mean, I didn't do it for any particular length of time, because obviously I kind of moved on into the field of working for the whole county. So, I can't take any kind of, I don't know what it's like to do it for any length of time. But I can imagine it can be completely exhausting. And I do hear of people who work in situations like that where it's exhausting. I guess the best place is what they do is they kind of think about not only the children and the children's mental health and the young people's mental health, but they also support their staff, don't they?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I mean, again, it's a bit of a link to my PhD, but my PhD was around looking at significant adults or key adults, whatever you want to call them, and how they work with they were only 2 of the children that I had, but our kind of most children that displayed the most behavior that challenges, because they were, they had suffered significant trauma.
Yeah.
One of them had got a reactive attachment disorder, which is a clinically diagnosed level of attachment need. And so they were,
Okay.
they were not easy children to work with. Neither were in a special school, so we'd managed to kind of keep them from a special school placement, because actually the 2 schools that I was working with were phenomenal schools. And what they did was they supported their staff, so their staff had regular breaks, their staff had, support, mental health support, they had like a buddy system. They had a hotline to me as a specialist teacher, all of those kind of things. But just going back, because when you were talking about something, I kind of picked up on something, because it's, for me, teachers do a phenomenal job, but whether it's special school or whether it's mainstream school, what you've got is a conflict, because there's so many teachers who would talk to me as a specialist teacher and go, I know I should be doing X, Y, and Z, but I've also got to do English, maths, and science. And it's that conflict between what we're told as teachers through the government as to what we have to do and all the boxes we have to tick, and actually what I genuinely think is the most important thing with our children and young people, particularly when we're working with very young children, is to develop their social and emotional skills, and, all of those kind of softer, what people call softer, but, I think they're kind of the fundamentals of what we do with our children and young people. But, you look at the education system in the UK, and we're asking our 4-year-olds to write, and we know that they haven't even got the bones in their hands to be able to do that, so it's kind of that constant conflict between what should we be teaching our children and how should we be teaching them. And I think that's where a lot of staff really struggle with that kind of conflict. And I know I can name a lot of people who I now know who do not teach any longer, because they couldn't reconcile that, because they wanted their kids to have fun, enjoy stuff. And, and there are some, I don't know how they manage it, but there are some head teachers out there who are, they buck the trend. So, I've worked in, and also my daughter went to an amazing school. When I first went, there were 28 pupils in the whole of the school.
Oh.
And it was just such a nurturing environment. Everybody knew each other. It was all about, creativity and enjoyment, and they'd think nothing of like going up a mountain and playing football at the top of it for their PE lesson, or they did lots of kind of outdoor art lessons. I've got pictures of her drawing sheep. There'd be sheep in the field down the at the end of the playground and stuff.
Love that.
And there's the odd kind of person who bucks the trend, and I'm lucky, that I know a few of those. A few of those are my friends of head teachers who kind of stick their neck out and put things like social emotional learning first. But they're few and far between, and obviously because we're driven by statistics. And once we get to secondary school, how many GCSEs, etc., are we going to get? So.
I was one of those people that came out of working in the classroom and stopped teaching, because I remember saying, I was like, I can't be the teacher that I want to be, because I'm so restricted by the things that I have to tick off, and the paperwork that I have to do, and the milestones that my children have to reach, when a lot of them, because of the training that I'd done, a lot of my key children were children with additional needs. So I remember saying, like, a lot of my children aren't ready for these milestones, but because I'm not ticking them off, it's flagging up and it's becoming a problem. And I didn't see it as being a problem, and I just felt like I couldn't be the teacher that I wanted to be. So I stepped away from working on the floor in the classroom, and subsequently went into research. And I remember thinking I can either stay on the floor like in the classroom and I can moan about how policy needs to change and how things need to change and wait for it to change, or I can go into research and I can be part of the teams that are actively trying to get the changes to happen. So that kind of fueled my changeover from being in the classroom to being in research. But it's really tough. I just want to touch on attachment because we've spoken about it a few times now. So I just want to talk a little bit more on that, because a lot of your work focused on that social emotional development and attachment with others. What can you tell us about attachment that you feel is important for parents or professionals to know?
So I kind of because obviously you gave a little giveaway that you gave me the questions beforehand. So I have had a little bit of a think about it.
Yes.
And I guess they're two very different things, I think, from parents and professionals. So I think if we deal with the parents first.
Okay.
So, in terms of attachment and attachment theory, the whole idea of attachment is that we are available and responsive as parents. They are the kind of two key words that I kind of remember that came through very, very strongly from the work of John Bowlby, who is the father of attachment, for want of a better word. And this availability and responsiveness, and the fact that, when a baby cries, clearly that baby's telling us something, and as parents we should be available and responsive to their needs. And so what we kind of do when we see, and we can kind of see parents doing this, we can see what they're doing is kind of mirroring their child's behavior. And that kind of mirroring, where we do like the kind of, when they're very little, where they make babbling and cooing noises and gaga and goo goo and all that sort of stuff, we kind of copy what they're doing. And when they're smiling, we smile, and we do it in a really exaggerated way, don't we? So like, you might be, I don't know, singing to them, and you do it in a really kind of like overt kind of way. And what you're doing there is you kind of building what we call attunement. And so you become attuned to your baby, your child.
Okay.
And it's almost like somewhere I heard, and I can't take credit for it, and I can't remember whose idea it was, but it's the idea of serve and return, like in a tennis match. So you kind of do your baby does one thing, and then you do it back, and then baby does something else, and then you do it. And that kind of copying and attunement and mirroring and all these things is what develops our relationships, and what it teaches our babies and young children to know is that if they need you, then you will be available and responsive to them, and you will help them, you will make them feel safe, you will make them feel secure. And that's the other thing that John Bowlby talked a lot about, was this idea of the secure base, so that your child can go away, so they become increasingly independent. But what they've actually done is learnt to be dependent before that happens. So they depend on you. They develop that bond and that kind of relationship with another person, or more than one person, because we know that children and young people can have more than one positive relationship in their lives. And they learn to depend before they then become independent. So once they can do that, then they can kind of go off and they can explore stuff, but they come back when they feel they need them. So basically, if there's any sign of danger, and this is what John Bowlby did, he watched kind of young animals in the wild, actually. And when there's any kind of danger, animals do, but also children do, is they kind of then return to the mother, or the father. He said mother. He didn't think fathers. Fathers were, in his words, a spare mummy. So he hadn't quite worked out that there were other people. And thankfully, his student Mary Ainsworth then said, actually, no, anybody can be a significant adult to a child. But
I suppose research will start somewhere, doesn't it? Research has a starting point, and then it's for others to come on and build and develop and go from there. And that's, exactly what happened with that.
There were other people around and about the same time. Kind of Harlow did some experiments with monkeys and things. So, but John Bowlby was definitely the kind of person who really came up with this theory of attachment. So that's what children then do, the more confident they become and the more secure and trusting they are in those relationships, the more they can explore the world. So they can then kind of maintain their own relationships. So as they get older, we know that the kind of trajectory of attachment changes. So you start off being attached to your parents or your carers, whoever it is that looks after you when you're very little. And the older you get, the more it becomes your peers. So you become attached to your peers. That's why we see a lot of kind of teenagers. They kind of, get together with their gangs, these are my people, that kind of thing. And then we go on to kind of like romantic partnerships, etc., and it kind of develops in that way. But what they also learn to do through this kind of mirroring experience is to regulate emotion. And so those children who are securely attached can regulate that kind of switch. And we know that it's to do with brain, different parts of the brain. And so if you've got a child who's hypervigilant, anxious, all of those things, because they've never been kind of shown how to regulate themselves emotionally, it's almost like you've got like a thermometer and they're kind of running at 10, and a securely attached. And so that would be an insecurely attached child, and a securely attached child would be running at kind of, 1 or 2, so it's that kind of thing as well. So, and all of that obviously kind of feeds into, a child or a young person's ability to learn, because we do all of those things while we're learning. So from a parental point of view, those 2 key words, availability and responsiveness, but we also need to, and this is what I came across so many parents who then started to worry that they kind of needed to be with their children 24/7, and if anything happened they had to be there, and that's not the case. And because there's some this idea of good enough parenting, and I'm not even going to sit there and say I got all of this right, because I didn't, and I've written 80,000 words on the subject. So we know that you can only do so much as parents. So it's not kind of that need for us to be there 24/7. Definitely not. That children still develop positive attachments.
I love that idea of being dependent before you can be independent. Like that, to me, looking at it like that, you would think being dependent would defeat the object of trying to build independence in a child, wouldn't you? So I love, and it completely makes sense when you explain it, to have that dependency, to build that strong, secure attachment, to then be able to grow into your own and be independent. And it makes perfect sense. But just describing it like that just sounds crazy, doesn't it?
Well, well, to me, because it's been part and parcel of my life, it's like, it's all for the last, I don't know how many years since I started my PhD, nearly 15 years, I don't think of it any other way. But you look at what do we do in schools, and all we're trying to encourage children to be independent all the time. And it's like, no, we've got to take a step back. What does Ofsted looks for independence, and it's just, no, if these children haven't developed that dependency, they haven't got that kind of trusting relationship, you're never going to move forward until that's addressed, really. And I think that is something that staff, because I've just talked about parents, but there's a lot of things that teachers and professionals need to be aware of, and I guess that's kind of one of them. And I kind of wrote a whole load of other stuff that some fascinating facts. So for example, 40% of our children, there's some research that suggests that they have insecure attachments. So that's kind of like
40%.
4 out of 10. Now, that's not significant need, because there are kind of degrees of attachment need. So I mentioned earlier about the reactive attachment disorder. There's not that many children diagnosed, or certainly when I was a specialist teacher, for example, I could kind of count on one hand the number of children who had that diagnosis. But having an insecure attachment of some sort, there's about 40% children and young people who have, and that's lots. Obviously, we talked about special schools, we talked about mainstream schools. So we know that some of our children who have social, emotional, mental health needs, they'll be in a special school, for example. Some of those will be in a residential setting as well. So there's going to be more of those 40% are going to be in those kinds of settings, aren't they? So I'm not for 1 minute saying that there's, because that would be like in a class of 30, that would be about 12 children. Um, but yeah, there are probably more than we think, really. And out of those 40%, sort of 15% are your children and young people who will have significant levels of need. So they're the sort of children who are, I don't know, they disassociate, for example. So, certain traumatic experiences are so bad that they kind of switch off and they go into themselves. They have like a fragmented sense of self, some of these children. So they might have, I've met children who genuinely believe that they are a cat, that they are a dog, they are a unicorn. And they're not just pretending, because that's the difference. No. Lots of children pretend to be all of these things, and that's pretend play. And that's exploring and that's perfectly a secure response. Right. It's the children that genuinely kind of dissociate and take on a kind of fragmented sense of self.
Yeah. Do you know what? As well, you're talking about the building that dependency before being independent. And actually, when I was reading up around attachment recently and talking about children, I used the example when I was talking to somebody about this, of the children that are dropped off to nursery, and when they cry and get upset when their caregiver leaves, parent, carer, whoever leaves, and you kind of assume that they're insecure. That's why they're crying, but actually they've got that secure attachment with that person, and that's why it's distressing when they leave. So it's that idea of building that dependency with the caregiver to then, and they're still working on the independent part with coming away from them. So then that makes sense in that kind of example, doesn't it? And it all slots together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to say, because that's the basis. What you've just said is the basis of the Mary Ainsworth was John Bowlby's protege, as it were, and she was the one that came up with the kind of way of measuring attachment. So she had something that was called the strange situation procedure, SSP, and they used to put individuals into a room and they would examine what they were doing when there was a set of toys and stuff, and then a stranger would come into the room and they'd look at what happened. But the most important bit was not the separation, actually, it was the reunion bit, because children who are securely attached, if they've experienced distress, they're in danger, they feel anxious, whatever, if they can then go back to their caregiver and you can physically see them, so if they're crying, then they go back to their caregiver and you can then see them being consoled and, come stopping crying and all of those, and soothed. Yeah, that's a really good word. Yeah, being soothed, then that's the sign of a good, secure relationship. Yeah. But, and equally, if they're isolated and stuff, people think, oh, yeah, they're independent. No, they're just really avoidant. They don't trust anybody, so they don't want to go anywhere near them. So it's looking, and it's kind of knowing what the same behaviour could potentially mean, given all the other kind of factors that you kind of learn.
Yeah, I think until you really pick it apart and like the way that you've explained it, it makes perfect sense. But when you look at it on face value, sometimes you can think the opposite, like we're saying with, being independent, but actually that's an avoidance tactic, and it's really understanding on a deeper level, and then it makes all sense. Something that you said earlier that I just wanted to ask more about, actually, because you said about building attachments, it goes from being their primary caregiver and then it can develop onto like their peers and things like that. And I didn't know that children can actually grieve the loss of a friendship. And this was something that I found fascinating. And like my daughter, when she was younger, had a really strong friendship group that she absolutely loved. And they had a row and everything, and they didn't want to be friends anymore. And the days following, she almost went through the grief cycle of all of these different emotions. And at the time I was like, I can't understand why she's behaving like this, why she's so upset. And I did a lot of reading around, and I came across this article that was talking about how children can grieve friendships, and she was going through the cycle of grief, all the different levels. And I just had to support her through it and get her through the other side. And we talk about it now, and we're like, do you remember when you went through that? And she was like, yeah, that was really hard time of my life. And she was only young. I think it was like end of primary school, beginning of secondary school. And I didn't know that you could actually grieve the loss of a friendship group. But it was such a strong set of emotions for her. Like, she really went through the mill with losing this group of friends.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally and utterly makes sense. I mean, again, going back to Bowlby, his book was called Attachment and Loss. So, I mean, he talked a lot about, actual death, people, grandparents and parents, but also things like, hospitalization. So we know that certain situations can lead to an attachment need, as it were. Things like parents put in prison, parents who are taking drugs or drinking because obviously they're not there to be available and responsive. So, that whole idea that if you develop any sort of relationship, whether that be with your parents or whether that be with, with other peers, or whether that's with your, partner or whatever, that, yeah, absolutely, that can lead to that idea of a loss, and yes, you can kind of grieve the loss of that, of anything. People don't have to die, if it's not there, it's not there, is it? So, a lot of those things, things like when parents split up, perhaps the one parent gets the child and the other one doesn't see the other parent very often, or there's all sorts of different scenarios, that can kind of lead to that, just feeling insecure about stuff. And actually you can go from being insecure to secure. So if you get a really good, so for example, if a child's been fostered and then they are adopted and they get an adoptive parent, they can work on shifting that insecurity to security. But also things like that, things like that example you just said about your daughter, or, a parent dying when the child's young, or, any of those things I've just said, being put in prison, etc., can shift from being secure to insecure as well. So it's not a kind of fixed state, and we also move in and out of secure and insecure in different settings, in different experiences, but with different people as well, and kind of, our professional relationships and things. They're all kind of reflection on what our fundamental understanding of relationships is all about. Do we trust the world, basically? Do we trust the people in it? And there's Inga Bretherton, she writes about attachment, and one of the things that just sticks in my mind is something that she said, and it's around this whole idea where, insecurely attached children, they just don't feel happy with the world. They just think they're worthless, and basically life's not worth living. And when you look at kids like that, who are displaying some of these behaviours that challenge, and I do deliberately use that phrase, behaviours that challenge, rather than challenging behaviour, because I believe that the behaviour challenges the staff rather than the other way round. This is why they're doing that, because they just feel like life's not worth living. And we know, several young people, they do unfortunately take their own lives. And, we know that the statistics of young men is, it's so suicide rates. And, you can kind of see that some of those individuals would be the kind of children that would have had an insecure attachment.
It's so sad, isn't it? But it's great that you've said that you can you're not fixed in that state, so there is stuff to be done to build it.
I believe that. I personally believe that. It depends, again, who you read. So there's an awful lot of people who believe that it's kind of set, and particularly with children who are significantly traumatized, maybe there's sexual abuse or whatever, that they cannot be helped. But personally, I think I don't like to take that whole view on it. And there's people like Steven Pinker who wrote The Blank Slate, who kind of think, been born a murderer and you're going to be, that's the way you are. And so there's a kind of continuum, some people that think it is, personality is fixed, and others who think that very much it's a kind of fluid. But that's certainly the stance that I took in my PhD and take now. I think that we can, and I have seen some significantly traumatized children turn completely around and have some amazing relationships with some amazing people. I'm not saying it's easy. Obviously, the more kind of traumatized those children are, the more work will probably need to be, because you're undoing years of kind of being insecure. But it can be.
Yeah. That's good.
I have hope.
I'm going to be there with you, hoping.
Yeah.
So we touched upon earlier that you are a parent yourself. So you have a daughter. How has your experience of parenting been so far?
Great. Ask a parenting expert about their parenting. Yeah, well, I was an older mother, so I was 39 by the time I had my daughter. And obviously, not obviously, but I had started my PhD thesis before I had her. So I had all these kind of preconceived ideas about what, good parenting should look like. And so no pressure there then and all that sort of stuff. So it was, I remember, I ended up having an emergency cesarean with her because she got the cord wrapped around her neck. But so it was all a bit kind of like casualty for her birth, so it was quite a thing. But I remember being handed her and it was like, okay, now what do I do with you? And I genuinely, it's like I was thrown into absolute like panic, I suppose, because I just had this small thing and I didn't really know what to do with them. So
where's the handbook?
I know, exactly. And I was literally like, hi, what do I do now? I say we because it was definitely a joint effort, me and my husband. So we only have one child. So it was a joint effort. And he was actually the one that stayed at home. So he stayed at home. He was a stay-at-home dad for the first 3 years of her life. I was lucky really in the job that I did because I could kind of come home. So I was breastfeeding at lunchtime and all sorts of weird and wacky stuff. But so I was lucky that I could kind of come in and out and, be there as well. So the first kind of few years, I my husband was very much at the forefront of making sure that she was securely attached and things. And then, as I said, she went to this very small school, which actually my husband taught at as well. So that was was another, so she'd go to school with him and, and had this amazing nursery teacher who was literally like Mary Poppins. She was amazing, just adorable. And then, so up until about the age of 9, might even been 9. Actually, my daughter was at the same school as my husband. So it was kind of like,
it's nice.
He was always there. And always there to do the school run and all those sorts of things, which is one of those luxuries I suppose you have when you're a teacher. But that was really important for us, obviously, and for me to get that kind of strong attachment with my daughter. And I do hopefully think I've got it. I remember meeting one of my educational psychology, one of my colleagues in the doctors, as you do. And he came over, he said, I've just been watching you. I was like, that's a bit strange. He said, I've just been watching you. And he said, I'd really like to video you and show, you working and being with your daughter, because it's a really good, look, it's a good example of how to kind of do that attunement thing. So that was good. It was like, I do know what I'm doing then. And I've had it validated by an expert. So that's all right.
Awesome.
But, yes, I've achieved. So that was really important. And I guess, as she kind of got older, I was quite used to working with, I was a middle school teacher, so I'd certainly done 9 to 13. So the age she's at now, 12, is the kind of age that I knew best how to kind of manage children. But it's always different when it's your own, and you've always got that kind of extra added worry constantly. I constantly questioned myself and still do. Am I doing the right thing? Should I have done that? We're all human. We're all, even, if you've written 80,000 words on a subject, you still question whether you're doing it right. So I do that all the time. But, I look at her and I think, well, she's not doing too badly. She can converse with most people, and, she has her own kind of things where she's more comfortable and not, but then, all of us do, so.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, but there's no manual, is there? Yeah. Like you said, nobody tells you exactly how it should be.
Even if there were, it wouldn't fit every child that was born. So the manual would probably have to go in the bin anyway after like day 2, because it wouldn't work for everything that we need it for anyway.
And equally, every family, because what I find happens is that schools and services, we're still not at the point where we're looking at the child within the family. I mean, I could chuck theory out there, Bronfenbrenner and his circles and things, and we still are very kind of, rightly, we are child-centric, but we have to understand that child is also part of a bigger system. And I think that sometimes is not given as much thought as it could be, because they are part of a bigger ecosystem, aren't they?
Yeah. It's complex, isn't it, parenting?
Yeah. It's not easy.
Yes.
Yeah. That's why I've only had one.
Me too. But so you say she went to the lovely small primary school and had her schooling through that. As I understand it, she as she got older, she then went on to EATAS, which, for anyone that is unaware, it's education other than at school. So it's something that the parents facilitate alongside the local authority. So not full home education, but more an agreement with the local authority to provide education that they fund and arrange via specialist provision. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with EATAS and your daughter?
Yeah, so it actually wasn't anything to do with my daughter to start with. There was no reason why she needed to come out of school, but it was off the back of COVID. And my husband, who is a kidney pancreas transplant patient, and so he was immunocompromised. So we were basically kind of asked by the school, about him and in the whole kind of, when it kicked off in March 2020 or whenever it was. And we decided that we would take her out of school.
Yeah.
And for us, it was a kind of continued, once everybody had gone back after the kind of initial period of lockdown and everything, we still had to be really careful because, unfortunately, my husband was very, very poorly with pneumonia. He was in intensive care for 3.5 weeks, which was not even anything to do with COVID. This was pre-COVID, so this was back in 2018, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to be really careful about, him catching
of course,
anything. And obviously, we didn't know COVID, and there was no. At the time, there was no vaccine. There was no anything that could support people who were immunocompromised. So we had to continue to have her in education other than at school. But I specifically do have EOTAS rather than homeschooling, because I don't want the responsibility for educating my daughter. Thank you very much. I do that enough. So it is driven by the local authority in conjunction with the school.
Mm-hmm.
That's the ideal scenario. And so what she gets is a online package.
Yeah.
So she has English, maths, science, humanities, PSHE. I think that's it. And then she also has from the local authority, so that's delivered by Academy 21, they're called. And then the local authority has delivered music and art and a sort of tutor to support her through it. But it was a bit, so we've straddled her primary, because we now no longer have middle schools except one in a trust in Suffolk. We've straddled her primary to her secondary. And it was much more kind of like the primary school were doing kind of Google Classroom, where she would go in and she would kind of be in the classroom with the children who were in her year group in the primary school. So the teacher would deliver that into now what's more kind of formalised curriculum, Key Stage 3 curriculum at Academy 21.
So she's still doing that route at the moment?
So she's still doing that. We thankfully, now there are some kind of drugs we know that are useful for immunocompromised people. We're working with the local authority to think about how her education looks. She's very insistent on things she likes and not on things she doesn't, aren't we all? But so I'm not sure what that's going to look like. But I get looked at from the local authority as being kind of a bit wacky and a bit kind of out there and alternative and all sorts of stuff. I get sort of thrown at me. But so for example, languages. She hasn't really done any languages. I do a little bit of French and Spanish with her myself. But there's a new GCSE in sign language.
Yeah, I saw that.
She's really interested in learning that. So I'm very I want her to do what she wants to do, because I remember sitting in lessons and thinking, I don't want to do this. Why do I need this? We've all been there, haven't we? You know? And I just think, if you know what you want to do, then, and she is very kind of arty and creative and those kinds of things. So I kind of want her to do those sorts of things as well. That's kind of our experience. It's the Academy 21 it's quite, I suppose, there are downsides to it. So it's obviously, she's not going into school. She's not meeting her individuals her own age and kind of socializing in that aspect. But she has a lot of people who we kind of have contact with, cousins and friends, and so it's not that she's not taking part. She's in the panto that you mentioned earlier. Yes. So, it's not that she's not kind of seeing anyone, because obviously, a local authority could look at it and go, you're, locking her up or whatever. And that's not happening. But there are downsides to it. So but it's always a kind of balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah.
Between what is, and that's why I suppose I touched upon this kind of idea that it's about what's best for the family. And you obviously just mentioned the big C in your introduction, and I unfortunately had my own cancer diagnosis this time last year, and so I'm now immunocompromised as well. So my daughter has two parents who she needs to be careful about, bugs and things, because it could make us very ill. So it's kind of, how do we best navigate the kind of education system where we all have our needs met? Because the last thing that she wants is for her to go into school, and we know children are full of germs, bring it back, and then we be ill, because Nick definitely could, that's my husband, can be ill for weeks at a time, so it's about getting that kind of balance but for me it's about thinking outside the box as well, because people are very, children go to school. Well, no, not all of them do, and you must know that as well from your own experience, and the number of people you talk to who kind of just have that, like, let's be a little bit more flexible with what we think education is. And I think that we're not very good at that in this country. We're not very good at being flexible. Children go to school and they learn English, math and science because the government tells us that they should. And I think we need to start thinking more broadly about what education is, and again, meeting the needs of those individual children. Because one of the things that I didn't say and you did touch upon it earlier, was about the developmental age of children. So I have met many a 15-year-old young person who developmentally, they are 3. So they're still experiencing, the emotions that a 3-year-old. So you're looking at like having a kind of meltdown, emotional dysregulation in a 15-year-old body, because actually they're developmentally 3. And that's what our curriculum's not very good at doing. It's not very good at looking at where is that child, in terms of their development, So I know lots of, young people and lots of adults who love Lego. Well, what's that all about? That's, because that's what they feel comfortable doing. And, maybe we're kind of meeting their needs developmentally.
And I think that's the beauty of acknowledging that there are different avenues of education, isn't there? It's did I see that quote the other day that said education is compulsory, not schooling, or something like that. And it's that idea of, yes, everyone needs an education, but how that looks to each family, each child, it is allowed to look differently, which obviously goes into a lot of my research interest around home and alternative education. So it's great that you've been able to access EATAS for your family, because and like you said at the beginning, it wasn't because your daughter needed to access it because of her needs. It was more of a family situation, and it worked for your family. So that's great that you've been able to access that. You touched upon, obviously, you spoke there about yourself now being immunosuppressed because of your recent cancer diagnosis. And obviously, as colleagues, we work together. So you shared this with me last year when you were going through your treatment, and you have spoken a number of times on various social media platforms about your experience of it, which is great, because I think it's great that you're speaking up and you're sharing your kind of lived experience as you're going through, because this is only last year that you got your diagnosis. What's it been like going through the past kind of 12 months with your family, going through something as big as that?
I think an emotional roller coaster is an underestimation of the whole thing. Obviously there's just the 3 of us living at home, and my daughter's of an age where she's aware of what's going on. So I have been very honest with her from the start. I'm lucky that one of my very, very best friends is a clinical psychologist. So I kind of knew what to do, but I just wanted somebody to tell me I was doing the right thing. So right from the very beginning, literally from the day I got a diagnosis, obviously I told my husband first, and then we sat my daughter down and we explained, what was happening, and, that I'd got breast cancer, and that hopefully, the hospital were going to kind of fix me, as it were. And we've got other people, friends and family who we kind of know who've been through the experience and come out the other end and had a good tale to tell. So we kind of used that as a platform to kind of talk to her about it. But I, first of all, was diagnosed with what's called metastatic cancer. So what that means is that from the very outset, unfortunately, my cancer was advanced cancer. And so that a lot of the, lumpectomy or, radiotherapy, which are treatments that are used on women who have smaller breast cancers, were just not available to me. And I was diagnosed with having what I now know, because I've read so much stuff, they call METs, one lung met originally, and then through various CT scans, etc., I was told that potentially I had more than just that one, and so that made me metastatic at the outset. And the other thing, because it happens when you have your first diagnosis, it's called de novo, so it's like a new, metastatic from the outset. So that really hit. I don't know. I can't even tell you what happened in those first few weeks, really, even now looking back on it, because my mental health was completely, and I don't mind sharing it with people, utterly shot. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know. All I knew was that I was told that, I couldn't have a mastectomy or a radiotherapy, and that generally just systemic treatments were going to be the way forward. And that, people do live on systemic treatments for many, many, many years. Systemic cancer treatments are superbly effective now, particularly for HER2 positive breast cancer, which is what one of mine are. So mine's that, and progesterone responsive and estrogen responsive as well. So it's what they call ER/PR as well. So there are lots of really good treatments out there, but basically that was a kind of life. Okay. I was told it was life limiting, and that, when you're 51, which I was then, and I was fully expecting to live to 80, that was horrendous. And I kind of went into a complete and utter shutdown. And really, for the first few weeks, I couldn't function. And I will say on this podcast that my husband was the most amazing human on the planet. As was my mum. My mum was really, really supportive as well. And, without those two, I would not have got through it. My daughter as well, she was kind of around and just, being there and hugging me and all of those things. But it was a very dark time for me. And I used to wake up and the first thing I would think about would be dying. And the last thing I think about at night would be dying as well. And I would walk around, and talk to my husband and go, I'm going to die. I'm dying, and I had a breakdown virtually.
I imagine it's kind of all consuming, something like that. To hear news like that and then to have to take that time to process it, I think that processing period must just be all consuming.
Yeah, it was. And I was really lucky. So I had a referral for counselling through Macmillan, and I had a lovely counsellor from Ireland who invited me to go and stay with them. And really talked me through the fact that it was kind of like a grief. We talked about grief before. Okay. Because you're grieving the loss of the life that you thought you were going to have. Yes, of course. And it's the grief process. So you go through similar stages of grief. But I kind of got stuck at one. So I got so kind of bad that so my oncologist was prescribing me diazepam, and I was like, no, I'm not taking that. And it was that really kicked me into touch. And I don't know, just changed my outlook, over the course of a few days. And I picked myself up and as best you can. And then I started to read. And that's what we do as researchers. And, don't we? We read stuff. So I was lucky that I had access to a lot of stuff through kind of, the research journals and things. And I read everything and anything I possibly could. And I read stuff around diet, I read stuff around exercise, and I read stuff around metastatic cancer and everything in between. Once upon a time, people would have looked at diet. I know that people were writing 20 years ago and saying it was you can't possibly cure diet, cancer through diet. And I'm not suggesting you can, but there are lots of things out there now that suggest that, they can either be helpful or they can not be helpful, and, papers from around the world. And the same with exercise, the idea that exercise, if you do HIIT regularly, you are 70% less likely to get metastatic cancer. Oh. So, there's all of this kind of stuff that's coming out now, and you'll find random pieces of research like, walnuts or, sheep's milk or, just stuff. And there's lots of people that have kind of looked into each of those different things. But luckily, after so much reading, I came across this idea of oligometastatic cancer, which is a kind of halfway house between having it metastatic all over your body and it being only in the breast. And I then picked up on this, and I just emailed people. So, I think that's part of just the way I am. If I want something, I'll go and get it. And I was emailing people in America, I was emailing people in Italy, I was emailing people all over the place and saying, what can you tell me about this? And off the back of that, I found a lady in America who's doing research around my specific type of cancer. So the what they call triple positive, the HER2, ER and PR, when it's first presented, which is de novo and oligometastatic, and the fact that they want to, her research wants to create this as a sort of subset of cancer, in terms of the fact that they want to kind of go out and show that we can cure that type. Because people were talking to me and saying, you can't be cured, this is, we're going to give you palliative treatment only. And so after finding that, I was then given a mastectomy and a course of radiotherapy for 3 weeks. And yeah, so far, touching all the wood that's possibly here, there's no sign of cancer, and there's been no evidence of disease since October. And even when they took away the breast tissue,
brilliant,
there was no sign. So yeah, I just, I think that my reading really kind of changed both my mental health, but also my potentially my outlook. I think that perhaps my reading, and that kind of, people say that that's what you're like, you're tenacious and all these sorts of things, and you don't won't let anything go. And no, I'm not, but maybe, just maybe, that's given me, if not saved my life, given me a lot more years than I might have had, because, there's stuff out there in Japan that's, you can read, and it suggests that you've got, women and men get breast cancer too, who have been living 25 years, since their metastatic diagnosis. So, and there's always the amazing stories of people. So, there's an amazing story of Peggy, and she was like 50 something when she was diagnosed, and she even younger than that. She might have been even younger than that, but she then lived to like 80 or 90 or something, and died of something completely different. Wow. And you're like, yeah, I'm having a bit of that, and it was that kind of trying to find those good, when you're in that very dark place, trying to find those glimmers of kind of hope amongst all those, because I was hearing statistics like, people like me die after 5 years, and that's really hard place to be, but then, the more I talk to people, and I'd say to, oncologists and radiotherapists and surgeons, people like me who are still alive like 15 years later, 20 years later. Oh yeah, we've got, I can show you a hand, people who are, but there's just, it's like all research, it's on the kind of cutting edge of what's happening, and they're trying to now kind of collect the data to make a case, really.
I suppose they say knowledge is power, isn't it? So by arming yourself with that knowledge and doing all the reading that you did, and finding those good stories and those positive stories and those happy endings, I think that must have been of such importance as part of your acceptance process of, right, this is what I've got, what can I do about it?
It's interesting you say acceptance as well, because I have, and again, I've had CBT in the past for various different things, cognitive behavioural therapy, and I've never found it works. And I came across acceptance and commitment therapy, which was what I had after my diagnosis, and that kind of idea that you can kind of just have to accept some of these things, and you have to let those thoughts sit, and they do come. I don't think there's a day that goes by where I don't think about it,
of course,
but you kind of just go, right, okay, that's fine, it's there, and we'll now move on. Because we kind of, this is where we are now. So,
and I suppose it's similar. That's what they say about grief, isn't it? You never kind of get over losing somebody. The grief doesn't get easier day to day, but you learn to accept it, and so you learn to kind of move on day to day. But it doesn't get smaller. It's just you accept it more, isn't it? And I suppose that's a similar sort of thing. And here you are now going into Panto.
Hey, we can get back to Panto eventually.
We've done a full circle. I knew we'd get back here.
I suppose you kind of, your whole, when you face death in the face, I mean, that's basically what I did at the beginning. Your whole kind of outlook on life changes, and And so, I've kind of been a lot more like, whereas before I would have said, oh no, I'll do that later. It's like, no, I'm going to do that now, So I've kind of,
Awesome.
after 20 odd years of not doing anything on the stage, I am back playing buttons in panto. And
I love it.
and just, I've got the opportunity to go and do some trekking in Nepal, and I'm hoping that that's going to come off. Again,
Wow.
probably wouldn't have done that, if I'd have not been where I've been. So, for all the kind of, awful things that it brought, can there be a silver lining to that sort of diagnosis? I don't know, but I think there are. It kind of, you do put things into perspective. It sounds a bit of a cliche, but you really do. So what if the washing up's not done? So what if, there's a bit of wallpaper that's ripped off do you know what I mean? It's like you just, things become a lot less important, and what's what's important is just, obviously for me, spending time with my family and but also my friends. When I was going through my dark period, I wasn't in contact with anybody really. It was literally a very small network of very close family who knew. So then I sort of opened it up to a lot of people, and I've just been amazed, absolutely amazed, and really humbled by the kind of response of people, students I've taught like 20 years ago coming out of the woodwork, and I've even got one of them coming to my panto, and it's just the students I was teaching over in one of the other universities all kind of getting together and wanting to raise money for me, and because there was a point where I thought I might have to go abroad for treatment, and just amazing. And then just strangers as well, because I've done sort of a couple of blogs and stuff, and you get comments like, oh, you're really brave, and you're really this, and you're really that, and you think, am I really? You just kind of have to do. You've got, I couldn't carry on being where I was, so I had to kind of pick myself up and do something about that, and just hope. I've been given hope now, which I didn't have, and that's a huge thing. But it makes you look at things differently.
Yeah, and I think by you doing things like this and talking about it and writing about it, you have the opportunity to give other people hope that are going into it as well. Because if you think back to those first, I know you say you can't remember much about those first kind of few weeks, months of finding out the news, but people going into that, it's so nice to know that as they come out of that processing period, there are things online that people have written. There are podcast episodes where people have spoken about it, and they can kind of tap into that. Oh, actually, this person was where I am now, and look what they're doing. Look at them on stage in panto, making the audience laugh. So it's great that
we hope
you're able to talk about. I can't wait. I'm going, and I can't wait to see this.
Yeah. It's going to happen.
And you said before that your daughter and your husband are both in it as well. It's a family affair.
It is a family affair. It is a family affair. There's only about 12 main parts, and we've got about a quarter of them. So yeah, we joked earlier, didn't we, that most of the people in the audience are going to know me. So
yes. Awesome. I can't wait. Oh, well, I wish you the best of luck with your panto and everything that you're doing. You're doing so many great things, and it's really lovely to hear about the types of things that you're doing. Just to bring it to a close, because Recap is all about embracing everybody and making everyone feel at home and part of a supportive community, I do ask all guests to have a think of one piece of advice or an empowering message to give our listeners to help share the love and support. So if you could say just one thing to help even just one person, what is it that you would like to say?
I thought really long and hard about this one, and there's just so many things that I'd like to say. But I think given what has happened to me in the last year, I think it's that idea about, looking after yourself and your family. And, I've got lots and lots of people I've taught and students I've taught in the past, and just kind of, I don't know, and embracing each and every one of them, because they're all just awesome, and you're you're really lucky to have such an amazing group of people who are kind of supporting and helping, and you're not on your own, so if you ever feel like you are on your own, just kind of reach out to people, because you'll be surprised who comes to save the day, I guess.
Yes, no, that's beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. You have been amazing, and it has been incredible to hear your story, your journey, your experience, and your insights on things like attachment and parenting and those with special educational needs. So from me, and I'm sure from everyone, thank you for all the hard work that you give to all the families and children. It's amazing. And I look forward to following your journey more and seeing you on the stage.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and I'll see you there. Yes. Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Take care.